The Tag on the Key, Book 1, The Plan, Chapter 27, Israel, 1974. As previously mentioned, I had all kinds of grandiose college and music plans during the last year of high school. I was planning to graduate early and start in the University of Rochester in January of 1974. Those plans changed abruptly when the State of Israel was attacked in October 1973, on the day of Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year. Instead of going to college, I did a quick about-face and got myself placement as a volunteer on a kibbutz. I flew to Israel that January. It was the winter of '74, and I was visiting the Friedman family in Karkur, Israel. The family was Shlomo, Tova his wife, and their 3 sons. Shlomo was the brother of Paula's first husband, Henrik, who was a key figure in the Jewish resistance to the Nazis in Poland. Karkur is a small community, not far from Pardes Chana and Hadera. The residents of the town are mostly engaged in agriculture. The Friedmans had some acres of land, upon which they cultivated oranges, lemons, nectarines, and avocado, to name but a few. They invited me to stay with them for a week before I went to the kibbutz. I was quite happy to oblige. They were truly hospitable people. It was in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, and my cousins and their friends, who had been on active duty, had just come home from the front. It was quite an experience for me to hear personally from them about the battles they were engaged in. A friend of my cousin, who was a tankist, told of the decisive tank battle in the Sinai Desert, in which they surrounded the entire Egyptian Third Army. It is a battle which is studied today in military colleges around the world, including West Point. When the visit was over, I thanked them and bade them farewell. My uncle Shlomo Friedman took me to a bus stop where a lot of young soldiers my age were standing around, waiting. Finally, a military bus came along. Under normal circumstances, I would not have been allowed on that transport. My uncle had a word with the driver, who then told me in perfect English to get your ass inside. The bus was taking soldiers to the Golan Heights, where, despite the technical end of the war, hostilities had not ceased. Israel was in the middle of a war of attrition. Every day or two, another soldier would be picked off by the Syrians. It made me wonder how many of those on the bus with me would be coming back home. I walked onto the kibbutz not far from the Golan, 5 kilometers, and then met the man who managed volunteers. I got my housing assignment and a laundry bag with work clothes, stopped in at the medical office, and went to lunch. I tried on some uncomfortable used boots, and in less than 2 hours, I was picking oranges for the first time. I met my roommates, or more correctly, shack mates, and went off to dinner in the communal cafeteria dining room. Some more Americans had just arrived, and the conversation was lively. The sky was full of stars, and the air was downright cold. I was given the job of filling up the kerosene bottle for the heater, which I did, and then collapsed into a rickety cot, or whatever it was that they called a bed. At 3:30 in the morning, we were roused from our sleep to perform a special mission. Trucks were on the way from the local slaughterhouse in Kiryat Shmona. Our task was to load thousands of chickens into boxes and then load them onto the waiting trucks. All of this had to be done by 7 o'clock. I had never carried a live chicken before. Now I was taking 6 at a time and handing them off to the guy who stuffed them into the crates. Shortly after sunrise, we went to breakfast, and then off to the next work assignment. This time it was the job of picking oranges. 10 o'clock break, back to picking till lunch. Tractor to dining room, after lunch, more oranges till dinner, which was a real feast for the tired and hungry. Work continued day after day. I was getting into the routine. Then, always when things started to go smoothly, something would happen. A Syrian MiG fighter jet would cross over into our airspace, and Israeli Phantoms would come, seemingly out of nowhere, to drive them away. I remember a Phantom jet dropping its wing fuel tanks in order to lighten its load and pursue a MiG. The fuel tank exploded in a field, sending a big plume of smoke into the sky. The MiG exploded elsewhere. Tanks routinely passed us by as they made their way up and down the Golan Heights. There were a limited number of tanks available to the Army, and they were constantly balancing numbers in the Sinai and the Golan and at the repair depots. We were located next to a tiny airfield. From the cafeteria, we had a perfect view of the runway. Helicopters came in every day. Once, during lunch break, we watched in horror as outgoing and incoming choppers got tangled in midair over the runway. The pilots were obviously looking in different directions. The choppers exploded in a large black cloud. All aboard were killed. I think it was 2 pilots, 5 servicemen, and 8 medical personnel. The English-speaking volunteers were approached by a man from the Ministry of Education in Jerusalem. The proposal was for us to tutor local school children in English. We agreed, and we did our best, but it was not a successful venture, as our command of the Hebrew language was quite poor. During the summer, children from that town went on a class trip, and many were murdered by suicide terrorists in Ma'alot, close to the border of Lebanon. A lot of the volunteers left, and some were asked to leave. I had my own shack not far from the road. It was also close to the restroom. The living quarters were not equipped with private bathrooms. You had to go outside and walk to the bathroom, which for some was 5 or 10 minutes away. I considered myself fortunate in that regard. On the eve of the Passover holiday, the Syrians managed to take over the summit of Mount Hermon. Israel scrambled to get its tanks up there from the Sinai. There were not enough transport trucks to do the job, and they were in a big rush to get the tanks up there. It was decided to send the tanks as they were, rolling right down the road next to me. It was only 15 to 20 meters from the shack I was living in. Everything shook. When the tanks passed, the road was totally torn up. Israel did succeed in driving the Syrians from the summit of Mount Hermon, and as far as I know, the Syrians haven't been back there since. There were social events and sports, etc. One night a week there were movies. One day a week, the volunteers could get something from the canteen. I would buy a chocolate bar, and I would take it to the movie, which was always shown in the dining room. I'd place the candy bar on the table in front of me, and the girls would often inquire if the seat next to me was taken. Henry Kissinger came around every now and again. It seemed that each time he would come, there was a state of alert, and work was suspended. Then we had to go into the bomb shelters. The shacks that they gave us to live in were not 5-star accommodations for sure, but the shelters were the pits, literally and figuratively. They were these underground structures which were accessed by a steep staircase that took one under the earth. There were these air vents, presumably placed there so that one could breathe. Despite the ventilation system, the air was really bad down there. When the order came to go into the shelters, we went down. We started to complain about the conditions, and so it was agreed that we could stay in the area upstairs. There was a lawn just outside the doors of the shelter, so that if anything started up, we could take cover in seconds rather than minutes. Fortunately, nothing happened that day. It was nice weather too. In the end, it was a pleasant day off. There was a man from a border town who was doing some horseback riding, and the horse stepped on a mine. That was bad news. There were border incursions from the Lebanon pretty often. We could hear Israeli artillery from close to the front, which was at that time about 40 kilometers away. You could hear the thud of the artillery in the distance. Many of the members and their wives were armed. There was one man who lived on the kibbutz, and he was a general in the army. He hardly ever was home, but everybody knew when he was. He had a special car, a Jeep with special military plates. His wife was an immigrant from the Soviet Union. She used to teach the volunteers to speak Hebrew. She had a baby, who she pushed around in a little baby carriage. Laid across the bed of the carriage was her very own M16 rifle. That lady cut quite an imposing figure. It was an experience that prepared me for later experiences. On the kibbutz, one is exposed to a strong work ethic, and there is no shortage of work to be done there. There is a strong ethic of self-sacrifice, of doing for others, because everything is done for the sake of the community. The kibbutzniks, as they are called, are proud of the fact that they produce more goods and services per capita than most other sectors of Israeli society. At least that was the case in those days. Their soldiers have fallen on the battlefield in defense of the state of Israel in higher numbers than any other sector. Quite often, it is they who are the volunteers for the most dangerous missions. With the exception of the religious kibbutzim, the average kibbutz is not considered to be a religious institution. It is important for me to point out, though, that my experience of the kibbutz was that of being surrounded by people who were, as I was, fiercely proud to be Jewish. I was sad to leave, but my friends among the kibbutz members assured me that I would be back one day. It would only be a temporary absence. On my way back to the United States, I took the bus south to Tel Aviv. As I entered the central bus station, a real hustle-bustle place, I saw an elderly Hasidic man walking on the bus platform. A young businessman with a briefcase came running out of a bus and darted for an open door some meters away. In his haste, he bowled over the old man. I rushed at once to offer assistance. The businessman slowed a bit and turned his head to see what he'd done. Shockingly, without a word, he just kept on going, didn't apologize or anything. I went over to the old man, who managed to pick himself up. He assured me that it was nothing, but I felt my heart go out to him somehow. He was not upset, and he was actually forgiving of the man who had just knocked him over. This was crystal clear to me by his words and his attitude. He had absolutely no ill will toward that guy that did that to him. The old man shrugged it off. With his shrug, something moved imperceptibly, but definitely inside me. I wasn't sure what it was, but there was something special about this man who had just been so arrogantly knocked over and dismissed. He too was proud to be a Jew, but the expression of his Jewishness was something I had never seen before. In a word, impressive. I continued on my way back home. In more ways than I realized, I really was on my way home. I think that I came back to the States that day that Nixon resigned.